able to be one of you and to be able to be invited to speak here from this pulpit this morning. I'd like to, especially thank Ned Dwyer, who invited me over a year ago, and a good friend, Charlie, and Barb Yost, his wife, who have been such tremendous hosts for us and guiding us to this place. I'm a longtime Lakesider, and so I know the value and great music that we have. I'd like to thank our musicians that I never get to thank you usually, but I'm so grateful for all the music that I've heard in this beautiful auditorium. When I was serving on the board, oftentimes a question would come about why do we have to have those conferences at the beginning of the season anyway? And one time somebody even asked if we couldn't get rid of the conferences, we could have a great summer. I wanted to, as I begin today, take a moment to tell you really what the conferences mean, especially for those of you who are Lakesiders but not United Methodist, or for those of you who are United Methodist but may not realize this. We as clergy in the United Methodist Church don't belong to the local church. We belong to the annual conference. Our membership is in the conference. And so if you're an Ohio pastor, you come to the conference every year for your church, and we meet in this room. So this is, if you will, our church. This is the stage where I was ordained twice. In 1973 as a deacon, and then in those days we had a second ordination as an elder, and mine was in 1976. Back in those days, my parents were here, my family, mentors, loved ones, teachers who've gone on to glory. So this place means so very much to us. And after those years, I returned every year, every summer for annual conference. 41 years later, when it came time to retire, I retired from this stage. And have witnessed hundreds of other ordinations and retirements in our covenant community, where we celebrate in this room Holy Communion, where we hear tremendous numbers of sermons, where not only are we ordained and retired, but where when we pass away, when we pass into the eternal realm, our names are read for the very last time. This is such a meaningful place for us. And I thank Lakeside for preserving it and for making it so real to us. From this pulpit, I've heard powerful sermons that have brought me to tears. Actually, my wife Debbie will tell you that I'm a crier, and I often cry when I hear really good stuff and in movies, and I have cried probably once, twice in every annual conference I've been to in the 46 years that I've been a part of this annual conference. And so as I think of this room, wherever I am in the world, I remember this place as my cry room. It's the one place that's kind of like home I know I'm going to come back to. So I want to just say how much we appreciate these annual conferences, the whole Lakeside experience, but especially Hoover Auditorium. And what an honor it is for me to one time be able to stand in this, as my father used to call it, holy desk, and proclaim the word of the Lord. So thank you for that. Thank you for singing There Is a Balm in Gilead this morning. The last time I heard that hymn was a year and a half ago in February of 2018. A group of us Lakesiders and some others from around our country had spent the night in a beautiful resort on the western edge of the Dead Sea. A beautiful place. I'd love to take you there. And as we rose in the morning, we met a new Jordanian tour guide and got on a bus in Jordan and drove some 4 hours south to the historic city of Petra in southern Jordan, in the middle of the wilderness where Moses and his clan traveled for 40 years in the wilderness before they could, after leaving Egypt, before they could enter into the promised land. As our bus climbed up the mountains coming out of the Dead Sea, we had one of those panoramic views where you could see the mountains in the distance and the valley in the foreground, and in the valley a number of villages and cities and farms and farmers and vineyards and olive groves. Panoramic view. And our tour guide said, "These are the hills of Gideon, the mountains of Gideon." I had no idea. And then he played this hymn we just sang on the bus stereo as we were watching that magnificent scene. And I was touched in so many levels of my head, my heart, my spirit, my soul. Actually, the Old Testament scriptures remind us that the real truth from the Old Testament is there is no balm in Gilead. There's nothing in Gilead which, as Reverend Peterson said this week, is beyond the Jordan that would bring healing. But as this hymn came about in the tradition of the African American spiritual, it was recognized that the balm of Gilead is Jesus, that heals the sin-sick soul. I've been very fortunate to be part of the travel ministry, as was mentioned in my biography, as the director of travel ministry for educational opportunities. I've had opportunities to tour and be a tour host and a bus captain in a variety of countries in our world. Next month we're going to do that in Italy and go to Rome. I love to travel. I love travel ministry, travel history. I love geography. But I have to confess that the highlight of all that work so far is still this trip that we took in February of 18 with some Lakesiders to the Holy Land and to Jordan. What a wonderful experience that was, to follow the life of Jesus, beginning in Bethlehem, where we spent several days, where Jesus, of course, was born, and from there we went up to the Galilee, where he grew up and where he had his ministry, and then ending the trip in Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified, where Jesus had his last days, his final ministry, where he was resurrected from the dead. In my work as a director of travel ministry, and hopefully much of my work as a pastor and a DS, I might seem like a very confident and competent person, but the truth is, I have a secret. This winter I was perusing and found a story that mentioned that a great percentage of the workforce in the U.S. Spends a lot of time and energy in their work time hiding secret from their boss, from their fellow employees, something they want no one else to know. I was touched deeply by that article because I recognize myself in it. I have spent 48 years of my professional life with something that I never wanted to explain to anyone, or only on rare occasions. But today, I would like to share with you my story. As I was ordained on this stage in June of 1973, I began my ministry in a small church in my hometown, Mount Vernon, Ohio. I lived and worked there and drove in a carpool with other seminarians over to Delaware, Ohio for our seminary education. That first year of ministry after I was ordained, I have to learn a lot. Learn to give a sermon every single week, not just once in a while. Doing much of the work that I could with the church's youth group and the young people in the community, teaching a confirmation class, leading the youth group, visiting my parishioners, and I had that very fall a first parishioner in my ministry that had cancer, and we knew it was going to be terminal, and I served there for 2 years, and he died just a few weeks before I left 2 years later. So I learned a lot in my middle seminary year. I performed my first weddings and funerals without any instruction from the seminary or ever a course in what you're supposed to do in those kinds of high and holy occasions. They're so important in the lives of families, and you're the pastor, and really no preparation for it. It was a hectic time. And in our family life, my first child, Tony, was born on June the 2nd, Pentecost Sunday. Pleased and honored that Tony and his wife journeyed from Atlanta, Georgia to be here this morning. A bit of surprise for me, so it was truly wonderful. As I remember that first year, but the other half of the story was that I was failing tremendously. I wasn't able to get my work done, my papers written, or my ready for exams. In those days, the semester ended early in June, and then we had graduation, and then came to conference for ordination, all in 1 week. So it was about 3 days after Tony was born. I did the honorable and right thing to do. I went over to the seminary with the intention of withdrawing from school. I didn't know what I was going to do, what would happen to my job. Pastors, of course, live in a place that's provided by the church. I would lose my ministry, my home, my place of residence, my income. But I knew that seminary was just too difficult for me, and I was going to fail that semester, and there was no point in going on. So, got to the seminary, there was nobody there. Finals were over, and the professors were away grading their papers. I found a counselor. I was studying for a master's in Christian education as well as a divinity degree, and the Christian education department had a counselor named Fern Giltner. Fern's husband was a history professor at MTSO. So I went to Fern and I explained to her that I needed to understand the process to withdraw from seminary, and as honorably as I could. Fern was a counselor, and she listened to my great agony, but she kept asking me questions, that inquisitive counseling. She kept asking me questions. She asked me all about my childhood and my youth and about what was going on. And we talked for a long, long time. And then Fern finally said to me directly the words that have framed my life in the past and my future as well. She said, "Dan, I think you have dyslexia." And then she explained that dyslexia was a condition which made it very difficult to read, and thus not being able to read very well, difficult to spell, and of course difficult to write. My whole past school life began to unfold before me. I had always been told that I was, early in the second grade, someone said that I was dumb. And so I picked up that tag, I was Dumb Danny, and I lived with it. There was times in school when I couldn't do things other students did because my grades weren't good enough. I was placed in a poor readers group, and I think that was the only actual extra help we had. Nobody ever told us what was really going on. I suffered some of the lowest test scores that I ever knew about or my friends and I talked about. I always had bad grades, and I had a lot of friends that had good grades. I was told I should never go to college, that I should try to find vocational courses that I could learn. But my mother insisted that I take college preparation courses. My parents had prayed long ago that I would be a preacher, like my uncle, her brother. And so I did take college prep courses, but I didn't do very well. I did apply for colleges, and I had a formal letter of rejection from my family school where my mother and my brother had gone to college. I got another letter of rejection from my dream school where one of my friends had gone. Finally, Walden Wallace College in those days accepted me on probation. If I could come and prove myself, I could go to college. And my college years were like the tale of two students. It was the best of times and the worst of times. I was a popular and active student in lots of activities, and it was the worst of times, as every semester I struggled with whether or not I would flunk out. I finally, the truth is I got off probation by taking a bowling course. And your grade depended on, they took the score your first day of bowling and your last day of bowling, and I passed. And it lifted my grade average enough that I could actually stay in school. The words of Fern even resonated with me with what one of her colleagues, I recognize now, had probably already told her. Earlier that semester, Dr. Browning had pulled me aside and said to me one day, "I just don't understand. There seem to be two Dan Drews. There's the guy who comes to class, is talkative, active, always participates in the discussion. And then there's this other guy who turns in these horrible papers that need lots of rewriting corrections." I had never heard of dyslexia. And when I was in school, there wasn't special help or even need, and nobody even recognized or said that I was a poor reader, just that I was a poor student. Suddenly my life began to make sense. Fern actually recruited a group of seminary professors to help me through my senior year. I took incompletes in that semester and completed my paperwork by the end of the summer. And that fall, with Fern's help, I not only was a full-time seminary student and pastor of my local church, but I went to see a neurologist to learn about some of the things and see if how my brain and eyes and all those things worked. Fern arranged for me to go to a speech therapist at Riverside Hospital down in Columbus, and I went to a speech therapist every week to see if I could be taught to learn phonetics and how phonetical sounds were related to words. And then on Wednesday afternoons in my hometown, I went to see a woman who was a reading teacher, and by this time had special students to teach to read. And she made me work with silly putty and clay and sand to draw words so that I'd understand how words really worked, and letters. Here I was, 26 years old, a full-time student, a pastor of a local church, and taking reading lessons with children and going to speech therapy. Somehow I graduated in that spring of 1975 by the narrowest of margins from seminary. I've had friends that have graduated cum laude and magna cum laude. I too graduated with a special distinction. It was called Thank You, Lord Almighty. I wish I had the time and could have really explained to you what I've learned in the 45 years since that time about not only my learning disabilities and how I function in the world, but also about the gifts and graces that God gave to me as well to overcome those disabilities. Because you probably know people like me in your home community. Many of them didn't go to college, but sometimes you remark about how smart they are, or how much they know, or how much they seem to understand about the world. Perhaps you have a child or a grandchild who has difficulty with reading. And I have learned a lot about my own reading disabilities. For 20 years, I learned and carried and studied a book called about dyslexia, and it was actually called Smart But Feeling Dumb. As I struggled all those years, I developed a very low self-esteem, feeling that I was always the dumbest and the most unworthy person in the room. But what I want to tell you about today is how I survived and functioned and even thrived in a reading profession of the clergy. I did so because of my faith. Frankly, I regret now that I didn't tell people the truth about my disabilities. I think it would have been very helpful to people if they could understand my limitations and yet my success as a pastor. I could have helped parents and children who do have learning disabilities understand the whole mechanism of that learning process. But I was too afraid of rejection and ridicule, of being held back by superintendents and bishops and the laity of the church, to ever admit that I couldn't read well, to ever admit that I was frightened beyond means to read publicly, especially when someone would hand me a poem they wanted read at a funeral I'd never seen before. So how did I survive? Well, my faith is prominent in my life. My preaching is very personal to me because I'm not trying to convince people of something that I'm not sure about or that I read in a book someplace. I'm preaching about something I understand. I'm able to survive because I do know there's a balm in Gilead that makes the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead even to heal a sin-sick soul. Oftentimes I have felt discouraged and think my work's in vain, but then I would be revived by the Holy Spirit and go on the next task, the next obligation. I preach every week, even in retirement, I preach every week to remind myself that God hasn't forsaken me and hasn't forsaken us. Hopefully others will receive the message. And this I know largely because I have heard and received the invitation of Jesus to follow him, just like our disciples did in today's lesson. Much as I'm intimidated to read aloud, I love to take people on tours. I love to explain anything I know and understand. This morning, I'd love to take you to the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. I'd love to really take you there, but we probably couldn't be back in time for lunch. But I'd like to take you there at least verbally. I was thinking this morning at the dockside service that we always look from the southern shore of Lake Erie out into the lake, but on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee is where Jesus kept most of his ministry and where he had this wonderful lesson we hear today. Jesus, after his baptism, is being thrust into the wilderness, temptation, comes from that into his earthly ministry, as Matthew describes it, begins to preach and teach and heal in the Galilee. And on this morning, he calls the fishermen. On the Sea of Galilee, there are families that still make their profession by fishing. And fishing is largely a nighttime activity. I remember just a few years ago walking on the beside the Sea of Galilee, and hearing a strange noise I didn't quite understand. And I looked down. It was dusk, and sure enough, it was actually a boat going out to fish for the night. So it is morning. The fishermen are on the shore cleaning their nets, putting away their tools. Other Gospels tell us that they were frustrated. It had been a long night. They had caught nothing. Let's just say that they were discouraged. They had received no income for their family that night. And into this scene, these fishermen, tired at the end of the shift, if you will, ready to go home and get maybe something to eat and get some rest during the day so they can fish again. Into that scene, here comes Jesus and invites them to leave their nets and follow him. And miraculously, as the story is told, they do. They leave their possessions, their family business, even their relatives, and they follow Jesus. For me, this is one of the primary scriptures of the Christian faith. For this reminds us that we receive a call, that not only Jesus was calling the disciples, but calling all of us. Come, follow me. I understand this to be the fundamental purpose of the Bible, is to help us understand that God indeed wants us to come into a relationship with him. I understand that God, who was the creator of all and the mastermind of the great universe and all that we see and that we enjoy, God Almighty wants to have a personal relationship with each of his creatures, his children, his people. I am mindful of James Weldon Johnson's poem, The Creation, in which he tells the story of creation. And he says that on the sixth day, God stepped out over the magnificent creation and says, I'm lonely. I know. I'll make me a human. As God, as the Bible reveals this story to us, it's God's continuing struggle to make that relationship with humans. He gives them a garden, and that doesn't work. And then he creates covenants, and the covenants with Abram and his people, and that doesn't work very well. And he sends prophets and preachers and priests to tell them how to have a relationship with God. And finally, he sends his own son, Jesus, to come and speak our language and be like us, born of a woman and walking on the earth, eating and drinking and talking and healing and preaching and giving an invitation. Come, follow me. I will make you fishers of men. I will redirect your life and give you a sense of purpose and hope. Come, follow me, and you can leave all that you have behind you. Come and be in a deep relationship with me. Come, and I will show you the meaning of eternity. So when you feel discouraged, remember that Jesus has said, come, follow me. When you feel exhilarated and excited, remember that Jesus has already said, come, follow me. And we have a beautiful opportunity to answer and respond. Here am I, Lord. Send me. Amen.
Thank you so much, Rev Drew. Let us stand as you are able and sing our hymn of dedication, Here am I, Lord.